Good evening and welcome you all to our first 2021 Boston RegTech Meetup event. I'm more than delighted to not only welcome everybody who have been able to join us tonight, but equally to be part of such an incredible event and such an incredible team that we will be presenting to you today. My name is Catherine Nelson. I'm an attorney and compliance counsel with over 20 years experience in large financial institutions, including Fidelity Investments, where I have more than a pleasure to work under the leadership of Chuck Senator. Chuck Senator will be our moderator. As you all know, Chuck, he is the founder of Boston RegTech Meetup team. Today event will be moderated by Chuck, as I just mentioned, with our distinguished panelists. All your questions, and we are positive that there will be many, can be routed through the Q&A function that will be available to all attendees. Subsequently, we will pass them on to Chuck and he will share them with the panelists. Again, it is my absolute delight to invite you to today's panel and equally welcome you at future events. Chuck, the floor is yours.
Great, Catherine, thanks so much. Hello, everyone. It's been a while since we've gotten together. We had certainly quite a bit of a hiatus during the COVID period, but we're back. And it's great to get the year started with a great topic and a great panel. Think about it. Before last March, business life happened where? At the office. Client meetings happened over meals. People flew to meetings and conferences. Seems like it's a long time since that happened. And remember what it was like to ask your boss to work from home. You were probably met with a suspicious glance since working from home was the same as goofing off. But COVID changed all that. All of a sudden, we realized we could work from home. We could be productive from home. The working from home stigma, in fact, began to just evaporate. We really didn't need to travel. The commute was a lot better. We missed the business gatherings, but business still got done. Net, when we think about it, when things end, we're unlikely to go all the way back. So we're faced with a prospect of a new normal where we stay at home and when Zoom meetings will be the dominating factor in our day. And it will serve as our primary connection points. And truth be told, for many of us, in this new normal, we'll probably continue to dress from the waist up. So that invites us tonight to pose a question as to this potential new normal, because what does this all mean? What will all this mean? Are there new risks in this world without meaningful associated in-person interactions? Those unscheduled impromptu meetings with bosses, clients, colleagues. And, with that, what does that mean in terms of the way we do business? What does that mean in terms of changes and possible risks? Can technology fill the void? And will there be any unintended consequences? So this is going to be where we're going to be going tonight. And there's a lot to think about. And I'm frankly really looking forward to working with an extraordinary panel and along with you, learning a lot from them. So let me begin by introducing our panel. First, Norm Ashkenaz. He's a CCO of Robinhood Financial. Some of you may know Norm from the industry. He has had a long history of having major roles in terms of compliance with major firms. He's been very, very dialed in with FINRA, serving as chair of their National Adjudicatory Council, and is a wonderful regulatory expert and will offer an important sleeve in terms of thinking about these issues. Wilson D'Souza is a chief technology officer at Akoya. Wilson has quite a background, but one of the real interesting things about what Wilson will bring to us today is that one of the things that his company specializes in is how to really be careful about identity and sharing data and how to manage people's access to data. This will likely be an important part of our conversation And on top of Wilson's background of having served as a CTO for major business units at Fidelity, will offer an important point of view for us today. And certainly last but not least, Mona Vernon. She is the head of Fidelity Labs. In addition to that being her day job, she serves as a venture partner at F Prime Capital, and she is an executive board member for the FinTech Sandbox. So welcome, everybody. So the new normal, I mean, it's something that's used an awful lot in terms of a thought. So I want to start maybe by opening this up for each of you to kind of see what kind of what has been your firm's experiences over the COVID, over this time during the COVID issue, and sort of see what would be the key things that have changed for you, and that's where we'll begin the conversation. So Mona, let me start with you.
All right. So I think, to pick up where you were describing the context, Chuck, I think there's a couple of things that are pretty interesting. One is, we for many, many years, perhaps longer than I've been working, there has been this concept of digital transformation that was top of mind for a lot of senior executive. I think we entered a world of necessity for digital acceleration, and that's because it's become not only a business imperative, but in some cases a health imperative, and finding ways to transact digitally. So that's been sort of fascinating to watch, and lots of innovations happening around that. At the same time, technology is enabling and being part. Personally, I wished much better in solution in fighting the pandemic. So there is a tremendous amount of innovation that is happening, and hopefully more, things that I wish could be there, like vaccines, digital vaccine passports, and ways to better understand this new normal. So it's to some extent some great propellant. These conditions have created more positive use of technology. From where I sit, I would love to see more of it, and perhaps it's about to come, since 21 looks like a continuation of 20.
So hold that thought, Mona, because one of the things we're to talk about is, particularly since as we'll get into this conversation a bit more, there's going to be a bit of a different dynamic in terms of how people interact with one another. So Wilson, let me flip it to you. Have you been doing much business in the office? What's been going on in terms of Akoya?
Yes.
And how have you seen some of the different dynamics between you and the people you work with?
Yes. So, we were spun out of Fidelity in February of last year, and then a month later went completely virtual overnight. Building everything in the cloud for us was a boon from that perspective. To the extent that the following month we gave up our real estate. So Akoya is a true 100% virtual company in every aspect, and and we've learned to adjust to this new kind of way of working. And our focus has been that when we built our platforms, we had to think of a world where things would be all based in the cloud, and based, where we can support clients across North America, as well as all, and on both sides of the coast. And so we designed it in such a fashion, right, that we could be virtual, we could work from anywhere. A little knowing that the pandemic is going to force us to completely work from your home, right? And we've had to learn to make sure that we had all the rigor of what was traditional controls that was there within when you have a building, you have infrastructure and you have all these controls and everything else. Well, we had to build this all at a virtual level, where we had to secure all our endpoints, we had to secure our services, everything even our VPN service is cloud-based, right? So everything we did, the only thing we were using was the local Wi-Fi and some video units, and everything else was already in the cloud. So for us, we had to build that security inside everything we did from the get-go. And I think that has served us well. And that has served a lot of companies that have moved to that kind of paradigm of working.
All right, so Norm, Robinhood, very kind of digital friendly, leaning in type of organization. What's been looking like? How has it been looking for you in terms of this experience, and what are some of the things you've been adapting to?
So I'll say it's interesting because I joined in September, and I've never been in a Robinhood office, and I haven't met most of the people in person. I've onboarded remotely, as have thousands of people since I started. And for a company that started around a handful of people around a conference table in Menlo Park, California, not too many years ago, to be having people working from their homes around the country is a massive cultural change. And that's been a big deal. I will also say my dog is going to be sad when I go into an office someday. Whines outside my office every day. But, in reality, it's tough because, you know, orientations for companies, onboarding is usually an in-person event, especially at a smaller growing fintech type company. And you have to try to recreate that virtually. You have to recreate the whole experience onboarding. I've been hiring remotely people all over the country without leaving my home office here, which is a unique challenge. And from a company standpoint, we have to think about, and we'll get into this a little later, what is it like to supervise people all around the country? We opened 2 regional contact centers in other parts of the country in September. When I say opened, we've never been in the buildings. We've hired people who will work there when we open, and they're going to be contacting customers, and we're going to have to adapt to how you can supervise them. We're doing that now, and hopefully longer term, I think it causes companies to revisit what does life look like? What do Wilson mentioned controls? What controls can you have if people aren't in front of you and walking around? That's going to be a different perspective for all of us we're working through.
Yep. And
Well,
Chuck, if I can just jump on, like on Norm's
yeah.
comment, like for Akoya, 50% of our staff has been onboarded since we went virtual, right? So the entire interview process, I haven't met a couple of my peers in person yet, right? Which normally would never happen in the real world, right? And that's been just a remarkable shift.
Well, actually, each of you touched on something that's unique and important for our discussion. So Mona focused on some of the issues around sort of the capabilities and the promise of tech. You talked, Wilson, about the importance of having the rigors of controls. And Norm sort of highlighted the issue in terms of not having sort of in-person contact with people he's met since he's since he joined Robinhood. So let's sort of start going down the road, thinking about these 3 points just for a moment. Because one of the things that I would posit as an important element when we sort of get down to how do we kind of manage the new normal is the effect that this has had on our relationships. So, so jumping off from the reality for many of you that you haven't met many of the people that you've hired. Frankly, as doing some research, it's very common. I mean, I guess there have been companies out there where, they had 800 new hires and not a single one ever met anybody. My son just got a new job. He hasn't met his boss in person. So it's kind of, but what does that mean? Because one of the things when we think about controls and we think about supervision, as we get down in the course of our conversation, is the level of in-person interactions are a real crucial point. So I'd like to invite each of you to kind of talk about your point of view or your sense of what it means. What has this meant to your relationships and the relationships with the people you work with, and how that can frankly drive, we'll get to the supervision questions and control questions in a minute. But so it's really sort of twofold. One, the effect of the relationships, and two, how has it affected your ability to the extent you're talking about staff that works for you, how has that affected your ability to oversee them? Anybody, just jump in.
I can start. I was one of those persons that loved to go into the office every day, right? I just enjoyed bouncing off, ideas. One of the biggest shifts that has happened is a quick 2-minute sidebar has become a half-an-hour Zoom call, right? If you could just turn to somebody and say, could you just do this for me? Is now you have to find out if that person is free, not busy on something else, right? And the "you got a minute" has become like the new meme in terms of like, obviously, like you wouldn't do that when you were in face to face because you could see visually whether a person was free or not, right? So I think for some roles, I think it's been a really this. I think you could argue there are some folks that love the heads down, no interruption, right? No one's going to bother me, or Wilson's not going to come and stop at my desk and ask me 5 questions because he's on a remote video screen somewhere, staring at his computer. And I think that's a big shift. I think that's been an adjustment, and I think there's an element of building relationships. I think that eliminates, and it's not easy to do so in a virtual setting for every possible thing. And I think that's really important. The little things you would do and then quickly go and celebrate, whether you go for a choice beverage after work, or go for a coffee walk, or go for a lunch or a breakfast run. Those are the interactions that I think that created that connectivity between people working together on a common shared purpose.
I mean, I'm a lot like Wilson, and that's why we're good friends, is that I loved that interaction. I think the technologists on my organization are probably more productive without me interrupting them the same way. And I just wanted to share this thing that I struggle with because I don't know the answer, but I think it's a fascinating arc to think about. I want to focus on what I know because that's the thing that's familiar, and I'll call it a knowledge worker. So this is really specific to someone who's, in my position, doing things that's fairly creative and collaborative. On one hand, I really, really miss the creative energy that you're in the room with someone brainstorming and hacking at the problem. On the other, when people talk about the degradation of building those relationships, I personally really struggled when a lot of those relationships may have been built on a business trip late at night in a hotel room, which was not very inclusive for me because that's not where I wanted to be. I prefer to be, home with my children, or there were just circumstances that favored relationship building of a more homogeneous group. So the way I kind of think about this is that since this disruption has happened in relationship building, as we go back, perhaps we can be deliberate in designing the rebuild so that we keep the stuff we loved, which is the ability to interact and be creative, but perhaps we do by design some correction. And I don't know what that would look like, but that would be an ideal new normal.
Yeah, so Norm, before we get to you, I actually want to put a slightly different lens on this question, because you actually, you are a current CCO, you've been a CCO in for major firms. And clearly the question of controls, the question of supervision is more than just a nice to have in the world of a compliance officer. I mean, I could safely say that. So let's sort of start from thinking about whatever the issues regarding relationships might be. I mean, I think Wilson told it very graphically that 2-minute interaction now is a half-hour Zoom call. That chance interaction, that ability to sort of be there and see what's going on and sense it and be there in real time, be among colleagues versus kind of this remoteness. I want to explore sort of like the downside of all of this. And Norm, I'm going to start with you because of particularly because of the compliance and control lens. What is it about this that can impact the ability for managers to supervise and oversee staff and somehow create the possibility of associated risks flowing from that?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with, this concept that people talk about management by walking around. You can't execute in this kind of environment at all. And I in an environment, at least in my old environments where I had lots of representatives around the country, registered reps and the like, would talk to managers about, what do you see that's going on that's not in the system? Because there's a lot of work going on in computer systems, trade blotters and the like, but at least in branches or in call centers, you can see which reps show up disheveled, who normally don't. You can see who's distracted when they're in front of you. You can walk by and listen to calls. You can pop your head in somebody's office in a branch when they're between customer appointments. You can pop your head in a seminar they're giving, and that's all very casual and just part of the day, and see how that goes. It's a little harder to do remotely. And by the same token, if you're in a trading environment, a lot of trading firms, no phones on the desk. Some would let you lock it in a drawer. Some you'd have to put it in a locker. You'd be able to hear everything that's going on. And everyone was out there. The manager's on the desk. The compliance people are on the desk. Well, that's not true at all anymore. So we've shifted to this environment where we have to find a way to replicate that, at least for the short term and possibly the long term. And the good news is with things like Zoom or Hangout or Skype or a lot of video technology, you can arguably surprise video your employees. They may not like that, but if you've got somebody who's a trader or a compliance officer or a marketing person, you can hit them with a surprise video and say, show me your workspace. Show me what's going on. How you doing? They're available in that fashion. And there's a lot more data being created because these discussions you mentioned, Wilson, I love the hallway conversations. Although I'll tell you, sometimes from a compliance perspective, two business people having a hallway conversation without someone from compliance doesn't always have an ideal outcome. So now at least they had set up a hangout and somebody says, should compliance be on this meeting? Yeah, they should, because it's got to be set up in advance. But that said, you can look at people's calendars and see what are the meetings they're having? Are they having any? And ask about that. Those are things that you can do a little differently. But when you put on a regulator hat, that feels very uncomfortable. And you've got rules written 40, 50 years ago that contemplate the world that I just described and expect you to physically visit certain spaces at a certain period of time to look for certain things, none of which is going on there because it's all virtual. So I'd start from those propositions.
Now, if
Well, anyway,
I
since
could
you
quickly jump in here, what Norm is describing is sort of fascinating because what it essentially is describing is an analog sampling for supervision, where if the information is fully digital with voice and text and video, knowing that now we can perhaps get even more information and make it completely global, continuous, real time, detecting emotions and intent, then it poses an interesting dilemma, or how are the rules keeping up with the capabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a case a few years back, an insider trading case, where the traders met in Grand Central Station, the two people with the information, and one of them passed the other information, who then ate the note. I don't know if anyone read that. We're in an environment now where I don't know that that's going to happen because everyone's working remotely. To Mona's point, there are tools out there that can look at the sentiment in somebody's emails and instant messages and determine whether they seem to be turning sour on the company. There's a creep factor there. And the other thing is, mention the phone. I've got a phone here on my desk at home. I'm not a trader, but how many of our traders have that phone at home and can just turn off the Zoom screen and call their friend and text them or whatever? It makes it an interesting challenge.
So for those of us that are not steeped in kind of like the lore of what could go wrong in a financial services firm, Norm, if you could just simply maybe pull on the string a little bit there and sort of explain, so why would it be important not to have access to the phone? Why would it be important to be able to sort of be there on the trading desk and near the trading desk and listening to people talk? Why is that important for purposes of supervision and oversight?
Conceptually, the firm is responsible for what the employees and registered reps are doing. If their job is to trade, the firm needs to know how they're trading, and they're supposed to be communicating only using the firm's systems. So if the firm gives you email, you use the firm's email. If the firm gives you Bloomberg Chat, you use Bloomberg Chat. If the firm gives you some other platform, you use that. And if the employee is not using it, then it violates the simple rules of we need to be able to capture it and supervise it and keep it, of course. And we can't do that if the person's doing it off platform, which means they could be insider trading, they could be doing prearranged trades, they could be manipulating the market or moving the market, they could be offering customers in a retail environment, tips on gold when the firm doesn't want them doing that. They could be borrowing money from the customer, and there's a string of instant messages describing what the terms are of the borrowing money, which is also prohibited. So it's this concept of we're supposed to know what's going on, and you've lost that capability unless they're using the firm's systems. And again, I should add, whether you're in person or not, somebody can still go out for a break, coffee break, and use their personal phone and do that anyway. But at least, it's a controlled environment during the day. But we need to figure out, Mona's hitting on this, other ways to figure out, other than watching somebody 24/7, are they in a mood or in a situation where they might want to do something they shouldn't?
Okay, so now let's sort of let's transition to another point. So Norm and the panels have introduced an example of the types of things that could go wrong. And we've seen how they're linked to the notion of not actually being able to be present. So, I mean, if I could see, for example, we talked about use cases like fraud and misconduct. I mean, the extent that people are away, the extent that you can't see them, the extent that they have access to phones where they wouldn't, in terms of to the trading desk example, how people may communicate to their clients and others. Actually, this reminds me of something we talked about during one of our prep sessions. I do want to go down this road a little bit. So virtual offices, or using virtual reality to sort of have a virtual reality meeting with your clients. So you obviously can't be there. First, I'm going to go back to Norm quickly for what's the problem. Then I want to go to Mona and I'm going to go to Mona and Wilson in terms of what could be some possible thoughts around how to sort of fix that. So fire away, Norm.
So it'd be nice if we were doing this virtually, to be honest with you. If we could have a virtual reality experience where we're all in a room together, that would be awesome. But it's not that far away to do that. And you're doing it on an electronic platform. So the interesting, again, we're looking at rules. Chuck used the word analog, or maybe Mona did. I think Mona did. There's an assumption here that there's something magic because of things are happening electronically. For time immemorial, somebody has met, a broker has met with her client, sometimes at a coffee shop, sometimes at the client's house, sometimes she's meeting with them in the office, and you don't hear the conversation. But if you put it into email, if you put it into a recorded Zoom seminar, if you put it in a virtual reality experience, then it becomes digital and electronic and can be stored, or the client could potentially store it. And now all of a sudden, there's sort of an asymmetry of information where the client might have a recording of the conversation that happened in VR or on Zoom, and the firm doesn't. And if something bad happened, the firm will have no idea until after the client sues or goes to a regulator. That's going to be a challenge. So we need to get past that. And I think the other part is, we're on Zoom now. You can't read body language, and you might, it might be easier for client customer to nod their head and say they understand a complicated concept by Zoom or maybe in VR, that you'd recognize from the body language, or it's a couple in front of you, that they don't really understand what you're explaining to them about an annuity product or a complex financial product, and you might jump in and deal with it. So those are some of the challenges that we face.
All right, so let's flip now to, I'm going to sort of go down a couple of threads here, a couple of roads about are there possibilities or are there ways to fill the gaps? We've been talking about gaps in perception, gaps in understanding what people might be doing. How could we fill those gaps? Could we fill these gaps in a way that kind of almost synthetically creates the same kind of supervision paradigm that you would have had in person? Mona, let me start with you.
So, I mean, I think this is an area that's really, really interesting. An analog to that is, in the call center space, I recently caught up with a friend of mine who runs a local Boston startup called Cogito, Josh, and it's an MIT spin up. And what they've been doing, so one, I would say that if you think about these technologies that are, enabled by data and AI as ways to augment humans, in some places that makes sense because the human can just work with those tools. So the example in a call center is that these guys have this really cool technology where they can detect when a conversation goes bad. real time and can nudge you to improve the conversation. This is based on a lot of like behavioral science, and it works really well in that setup. But there's a lot of um, design work to address Norm's concern about the creep factor. I mean, all of this stuff is about fundamentally great human computer design. I think taking that lens and starting to apply it to the compliance space is greenfield, and such an opportunity. And for those on the call here on the panel know how excited I am about it, because we're really at this interesting point to bring a lot of this data that we're generating right now, for instance, and then starting to figure out how to apply methods from other fields to it, but then also bringing that design lens. What would be useful? What would be too creepy? What would actually not be augmenting, but getting in the way of the workflow of the trader, for instance? But at the same time, I also believe it needs to co-evolve with the regulators, which is why I'm so excited to see some of the advances that FINRA has done this summer around AI. So I do think we're at the dawn of something pretty interesting when you look at other domain and how it could be applied to the RegTech or the compliance space.
So let's go down a click or two. Okay. So let's take an example. Employees. Well, we all many of us have in this space have suffered over like email. So why not go down that road? Okay. So let's start by thinking about if we had to kind of engineer something. And Wilson, I'll start with you here. What would be the elements of data? You had spent some time at Fidelity as a CTO. You're a CTO now at Koya. What are some, if you had to, Mona's talking about some cool stuff that might be able to detect sentiment, for example, but you need data for it that can help, so it can sort of fuel it, right? So what would be the kinds of data and how would you get it? And what would be the kinds of data you would need to marshal to even sort of begin to feed the AI algorithm?
Yep. So we had actually a speaker event yesterday that we hosted, and I had the pleasure of having Professor Sandy Pentland actually discuss this very topic about how to think about data and this concept of data cooperatives. It's something that we've put a lot of attention to within Akoya as well, which is while right now, most of the models are you bring the data, into a central kind of repository and you apply your algorithms or your code to that. And I think what we're going to find is a movement where the algorithms will be applied to the data where the data resides. And so this way, A, you're not making copies of the data, right? B, you're facilitating rules and filters and intelligence right at the source, so that when it needs to be processed, right, it's done there and not sitting and it's been control of that entity. So think about, there are a bunch of startups now looking at using this concept and applying it into personal data. If you read up on what Tim Berners-Lee's new venture is, and they commercialized into a company called Inrupt, right? They're basically saying, hey, what if all my data could be sitting in a pod that I control, right, at a localized level, and then I selectively allow who I want to grant this to for all kinds of reasons, whether it's for commercial reasons, whether it's for sharing reasons. Because right now we're just trying feeding a few of the beasts in just terms of they're collecting all the data, right? And so I think you're going to see a little bit of disintermediation of data, where a lot more control, I think, will be with the entities that actually own that data and not somebody who's aggregating the data. And for us, I think that's where we see our future is. We want to make that happen, where we put the folks that own the data or are custodians for the data, and then for the data that it belongs to, right, which could be consumers or some other institutions, and we apply and facilitate that kind of movement of that data and apply the logic or the algorithms at that source. Right? That's what I see. Increasingly, I think you're going to see much more of that kind of distribution.
Well, I'm actually beginning to have a little bit of a PTSD, having listening to, thinking about this a little bit. Here's a PTSD because I too had run global compliance programs, large compliance programs like NORM and other settings over the years. And so if we're in the middle of this new normal and people aren't interacting, and we have these possible tools, which we're gonna have to go down a little bit further in terms of how to sort of fill the gaps of not having people in person. And then Wilson just talking about data, but I seem to remember struggles that many firms had in terms of how to access data, the fact that data has been siloed, different elements of businesses don't talk to one another. And if you can't sort of harness the data, how can you pull together these sort of super cool solutions that could end up creating a reasonable system of supervision that's not based on in-person interaction? So help me through my nightmare here. What would be some of the issues that we'd have to think about? Because you would need to have a reasonable system of supervision today. So what I'm going to do is like sort of start up a norm in terms of sort of making sure people understand what that means, a reasonable system of supervision in this context. Then I want to sort of just pull on the levers about how to kind of get there and make sure firms aren't having a gap in this area. So Norm, we'll start with you.
And Chuck, maybe I'll say that I might have present STD, present stress traumatic syndrome here, because the regulators have data. Firms are feeding data to regulators, be they investment advisors, brokers, private equity. They're feeding that to FINRA and the SEC, and they have increasingly complex tools. FINRA is actually starting projects to look at deep learning for surveillance with all the data the firms are feeding them. And that means that firms have to actually solve the issue you're talking about, Chuck, which is getting their arms around all the data. And frankly, the risks you have are if there's data being created at your firm and you haven't looked at it yourself, but your regulator has or asks for it, that's going to be a problem. Again, I mentioned asymmetry earlier. They know something about you and your firm and your reps and your customers that you don't know. But if you've got it all siloed and it's being fed through different systems to different regulators or even just different parts of your firm, that creates a significant problem. And this is where firms are starting to look at data stewards, data standards, data policies. And it becomes a real challenge because not all the systems talk to each other. And you run into challenges where one part of the business knows something about your customers. Another part of the business may know something different about the customers because they're in two different businesses and the systems don't talk to each other. So these are the problems we're all really trying to solve. And before we can even get to use the cool tools Mona's talking about or Wilson and deep learning, we need to harness our own data. And that is something we're all worried about in compliance.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of go down to a particular use case to help sort of illustrate this. So let's think about a trading desk. So clearly over time, traders and most firms had compliance people literally physically there. And they recognized that they need to be physically there for the reasons, Norm, that you alluded to earlier in terms of there's a lot of chatter that goes on the side. To be in the room where people are actually on the phone. God knows there's been all sorts of issues in terms of unfortunate Bloomberg chatter, that people aren't there to sort of witness it. And so you have these expectations. Being a former regulator myself, so this being there actually is a reasonable system of supervision. And for those of you not on the call, not in the securities field, that's actually a statutory and regulatory obligation where you can get whatever there's liability. So now let's just for a moment now the compliance officer is gone, not there. This is remote. And for all the reasons that Norm was talking about before in terms of, we don't know whether they're making a secret phone call off of a cell phone. You would see it if you were there in person, but you don't know that now. You don't know all this stuff. So the danger facing financial services firm would be, has the system of supervision when you have lost this ability to see it live, has the system of supervision now all of a sudden become unreasonable if something, God forbid, goes wrong?
Yeah.
So what I'd like to now bring to Mona and to Wilson is, we clearly have a gap. if we use my use case that I just put out there as a gap, right? Person's not there to watch. How do you fill the gap? And how is it that you can make a case to the regulators that oversee you that whatever technology you can use to fill the gap would be reasonable? And then to the point, going back to Wilson, talking about what would a firm need to do to sort of get up and running to make sure that the data necessarily do that is available to fuel Mona's super cool use case. So Mona, let me start with you in terms of what solutions could be out there for that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's good to pick up from where Wilson left it. I think there is, you know, I was just thinking about how long it has been since we've been talking about data and cloud. And I think we're at this point where that continues to be the important layer to solve for. And then the other element of it is a comfort level, right? So, you know, there's still a I still think there's definitely a technology gap, but perhaps the bigger gap really is about getting a shared understanding on what the technology is capable of doing. And, so, you know, the parallel I keep thinking in my head is that, you know, in this tax space, there's always been this model of doing audits where, you know, the question would be like, what would that look like if the audit was all based on all documents, you know, accessible, run through some text mining tools and through some analysis. So forget the subtlety of the human intent, which is a harder problem in our domain. So I have a hard time figuring out if the hardest part is, you know, how smart do the models and the technology and the software has to be on top of a data set that's sufficient and well designed, like the way Wilson would describe it, or is it our ability to kind of co-evolve the structure and the regulation along with it? I would love to hear, you know, the Wilson's position on this. My hunch right now is there are things happening, particularly this year and obviously through last year, that are pretty telling. Things like digital court and showing up in court digitally, things that were unheard of before that by necessity have been done and setting a precedence. Seeing your doctor digitally, for instance. And so I think those are normative changes that are basically going to open up some conversation. And I think the technology actually will catch up, provided that, you know, we get all the last mile of the data right.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the tech doesn't exist yet, right? And I think it's being shaped and formed right in front of us. If you think about where we are across the globe on the quality of access of internet, we have to thank a few streaming companies that enable this thing, right? They started about 10 years ago or 15 years ago, because they had to solve this thing at scale, right? Because their entire business depended upon creating this thing. And so we have this fabric that was created where we could layer on new sets of services. I mean, if you think about, you know, the growth of, like, think about the video calling, right? You think about school. If you read some interesting personalities on the future of universities and college, right? A lot of those dimensions are going to change. My son recently got one of his cloud certification tests done online, right? And he had to show his cameras to make sure, right, that nobody was around or that he had, you know, it's a clean desk. So I think there are methods that are going to come out of this, right? I don't think they're fully baked in. There are some that are going to work. Back to the point about compliance. I was there during the time when the way we thought about storage was this old, you know, worm tapes, right? And optical disk. And now you wouldn't even think about this, right? It's software-based storage now, right? So we can make that worm. So I think we're going to see a more and more evolution of that kind of. I don't think we're quite there, and we haven't. I don't think enough people have spent space understanding the requirements from a regulator's lens, right? Especially in the tech world. I think that's why I think RegTech is such an important forum, because I think this is a really a big greenfield opportunity for companies that are looking to solve, because this is going to be the new norm in some spirit, because people have shown it's possible to do it this way, right? Whether we want to sustain it on a permanent basis is a different matter.
Yeah, but as we think about it, sorry, Chuck, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Norm. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, what we can do though is, so in many cases, we talked about not being able to supervise interactions, or we've talked about cameras in the home, which can create its own issues. I saw a question on that, can create some challenges as well for people to see your home.
Yep.
Part of what we have to do is look at what are the outcomes. And again, there's a lot of data out there, and say, okay, we've got two people, both in the same role, doing a similar thing. What are the outcomes of what person A and person B are doing? Is person A an outlier versus person B on certain things that are good and certain things that are bad, and why? And you can start crunching data on that. You're going to lose potentially some of the walking around we talked about, but it might give you more time to crunch some of the data on things like that. And you made a comment about worm, Wilson. There's still something called worm as an SEC standard out there, and there's been discussions for years about replacing it. But we have to be just thoughtful about what we do with all this data, and the regulators are looking at the outcomes as well. So we need to be doing the same, and they have much more advanced tools than people might realize. And firms have them, but oftentimes they're being used to better service customers or to better, the experience for employees and compliance or legal or audit. They're sort of trying to get those things, and it's not as easy to get that attention.
I would submit that. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about in terms of the possibilities of technology sort of augment oversight, governance, compliance. I would posit that was on a track anyway, because that would be important to sort of, as evolution, as technology evolves, regulatory expectations evolve with it. And so what was okay today will probably be insufficient tomorrow. And the only thing that seems to strike me about a lot of what's happening in this conversation today is that we have actually put ourselves in a position, because of the possibility of this new normal, of needing to kind of have a booster to sort of get to a place faster. So Norm was talking a little bit about regulators. I want to shift there. By the way, I've noticed a number of questions, and I have been looking at them, but a number of them have to do more specifically with the news of the day involving Robinhood. And frankly, I'm not going to go there. So this is really more of a specific Robinhood issue, and it's really sort of out of scope. So with all due respect, I'm not going to put Norm in that position, nor would I put Robinhood in that position. But there was one question that really sort of talked a little bit about the regulators in terms of where they are on all this, in terms of where they are in terms of their ability to do their surveillance. And I think we should go down that road a little bit, because the way I think about going back to the concept of a reasonable system of supervision, to the extent that technology has greater capability, regulatory expectations are going to rise with that capability, and expectations will rise with that capability. So there needs to be an alignment between what the regulators are doing and expect, and what the firms are doing in terms of where they are with their tech. So I know that a couple of my panelists are pretty well versed in terms of what's been going on with the regulators, what they're thinking about. The regulators themselves have been devoting resources to tech. So let me start. I'm going to go Norm, Mona, and then Wilson. I'm just talking about the types of things regulators are thinking about. So fire away.
Well, so I mentioned briefly, FINRA is looking at using machine learning and deep learning in their surveillance program. That will be game changing for them. I think they will have an expectation that firms will start doing the same, would be my guess. They'll think that's reasonable. And I worry, an aside, if you're a small broker-dealer in the broker-dealer space, which 3,000 of the members are, will you have the capabilities of doing that? I don't know. There might be an opportunity for a firm to help them, but that's going to be a challenge. FINRA has put out papers on AI just last year. They've convened working groups. They've had conferences. I know Mona has worked with them, Chuck has worked with them. They are reaching out heavily, and so is the SEC on these topics. And they're actually open to having conversations about this with firms. They want to know, they want to actually hear from firms and from members, what do we think reasonable looks like? What do we think their approach should be on things? The challenge is, as we mentioned, there are some rules that are still out there that haven't gone away. And one of the things we've talked about is sandboxes. Mona's part of a sandbox. The regulators don't really have a sandbox here in the US, so we don't have an ability to say, hey, let's do something different. We want to supervise our reps differently. We want to try this out. We're going to go ahead and do that. And we're going to ignore these 4 rules. That's no capability to do that now. So that's something we need to work on. They're open to the conversation. And I would also say during the last year, they have been flexible in letting firms do different things during this COVID pandemic period. And there is discussion about permanent changes, like maybe letting us do remote supervision, maybe eliminating in-person exam requirements for physically visiting somebody's home because they happen to be approving marketing material. That's all in the firm systems. They've actually been administering regulatory exams remotely. Your on-site exams and letting people take tests remotely, like Wilson Sun. They're letting you do that. So that stuff they're open to adopting long term. So maybe I'll leave it there for a second, hand it to Mona.
Yeah, I mean, I thank you for covering all of those. 2 things, 3 weeks ago, as you know, FINRA announced they were postponing reopening their 69 sites for arbitration. And as I had mentioned earlier, we know some courts are becoming more comfortable with digital hearing or virtual hearing, whatever you want to call it. So that's an interesting question of what that might look like long term also, and how might you conduct those? Again, another really interesting question beyond April 21st, and whether or not that physical space and is how that evolves. The second thing I wanted to add around this topic of AI that I'm really passionate about is the ability to do partnerships, public-private partnerships, and exploring the use cases. I'm a firm believer that there is a tremendous opportunity that happens, to Wilson's point, very well driven and designed around the specific requirements and use case that we need to really understand and with the regulators. And this is a space where I would predict that between now and the next few years, this sort of notion of thinking about what is ethical or participatory AI, this is not trivial stuff. It's gonna take a lot of really great collaboration across multiple domains to get it right. But I actually think that this is the right time to do it because it can be so helpful in helping us manage this, partially remote, full remote, definitely some use to the virtual. So just pointing out that so much opportunity to get the AI one right, and then this notion of what stays virtual and for how long, and can we explore them?
Yeah, so I'll just first of all I'll start. Today is actually Data Privacy Day, and so it's a very opportune day for us to have this discussion. And it's something we at Akoya and specifically I spend a lot of time around thinking about privacy and data. And I think increasingly you're going to see, I think, a larger rigor. I think the events of the last 2 to 3 years around data and how data is used, right? Whether it's for AI, whether it's for driving new kinds of business opportunities. I think I come back to the perspective of I think we have to do right by the persons that own that data, whether they are owning it as a custodian or it actually belongs to them. And I think there's a degree of rigor that we'll have to apply in terms of understanding some of the potential regulatory or even from a we may have some new laws, right, that will drive on how some of these things are done. And like I said, I don't think they're all shaped out and fleshed out yet. I think what some of the things that we're already doing for example, we within our Koya platform don't store any data. We don't have any PII data, right? We're largely a delivery network. We are more of a connections aggregator rather than a data aggregator, right? And increasingly you're going to see that you're going to see more of that kind of enablement where you remove the need to and reduce the risk, right, at different endpoints. And I frankly feel technology will play a role, but again, I still think there's a lot more understanding of how we evolve some of the control, like the regulations that we have, just to meet the modern times. Because the way you do supervision in the future will not be the way we've been doing it in the past, and things are going to accelerate faster, right, than we thought it would.
Wilson, we're getting close to time, but I do want to close on one other thing, which I think is an important element of a new normal, particularly if people are dealing with each other remotely. You talked about one, privacy. The other one had to do with, there was a recent study the FBI put out in terms of the actual increase in attacks on home computers for people sort of working from home because they don't have the same defenses as an enterprise firm. So what do we do about that?
Yeah, so great.
Talk a little bit about your Acquire solution, because I think it's really cool.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So first of all, I think there is we recently had one of the most significant cyber attack, probably at least for me, I think this is the biggest one in my lifetime. Right? And as it demonstrates, the sophistication of state actors and everything else is tremendous, as we just saw, right? I think we've seen attacks, right? If those who have been in the cyberspace will tell you that they've been seeing attacks on home networks for ages, right? You have all kinds of devices in home networks, right? And especially so you're increasingly going to see work computers, right, leverage more and more security software and VPNs that are always on, like most companies, because of that risk, because you've now moved, right, where every endpoint is potentially a vulnerability for the whole network, right? So this concept of zero trust, where you have to assume that the endpoint is not to be trusted and it has to follow certain rules, will have to be incorporated into everything. There are a couple of tech companies, I don't want to necessarily this, but a lot of the tech companies that are driving a lot of solutions both for the enterprise as well as for the consumers are increasingly thinking of that kind of mode of thinking about zero trust, where you don't trust the endpoint. And you put rules and gating rules of how you graduate the access for that device or for that person using that device. So you're going to see more of that kind of stuff, because at the weakest point when you're working 100% virtual is the endpoint. Right? You can put all these controls you had in the office, but now you don't have it. Your office just went to somebody's home or thousands of homes.
Yeah. Well, I think we're getting close to time. We could just keep going, but I guess there are others. I mean, we probably need to see families and friends, and we could be here all night. I guess I'm sure our audience might feel the same way. Look, one of the things that seemed to be there were a number of different important issues here, but clearly what might have been a normal sort of progression actually needs to accelerate in terms of how we sort of keep up with making sure that we have principles, supervisory principles, making sure that customers of the firms are in great places. It's going to call for a lot of solutions. And in closing, the people that are in this RegTech community here in Boston, those have made the over 800 RegTech meetup members that we have, those are the people that are going to be in the middle of being instrumental of working on those solutions. So it's great to be part of that community. Wilson, Mona, Norm, awesome to have you. As I said, I was hoping to learn a lot. I certainly did. And I want to thank you so much for a wonderful event. And I'm sure that I echo the sentiment of the audience as well. So take care, everyone. Have a great night. and be well.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.